A video version of this episode is available on the Kansas Wheat YouTube channel, @KansasWheat.
Welcome back to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. Justin and I are here. Thought we might do a little post-game wrap of our conversation with Jerry Moran and touch on a few topics. And Justin, Senator Moran's a great guy. There was so much more we could have talked with him about, and I think we probably should dive into a few more details about what was in that reconciliation package. But overall, just give me your thoughts on what we just visited with.
Well, being able to visit with him on a Saturday morning here at the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center was a pretty unique experience, and we appreciate him reaching out to us while he was in town and being able to get Dave up here and make it work. Your listeners are going to appreciate hearing his thoughts and being able to have that discussion. I really enjoyed it also. Kansas is in such a unique position, and being able to have such strong advocates for our agricultural issues in D.C. with having both Doc Marshall and Senator Moran on the Senate Ag Committee, and of course Congressman Mann on the House Committee, along with Congresswoman Davids. We're in a good position for those discussions, and being able to have our commodity groups, our sister organizations, being able to come together on common issues for agriculture. I know a lot of other states look at us and are pretty envious of the position we're in, and it's just really important that we engage in those discussions in the right way and work with our partners for the betterment of Kansas agriculture because of its importance to the state of Kansas.
We covered a number of important things I would like to touch on. We talked about the disaster enrollment, which I think is important for farmers to be aware of, but just going through a few quick things here in the reconciliation bill. Reference prices for PLC were increased, addition of new base acres, ARC guarantees increase, and for this crop year, for the 2025 crop year, farmers are going to be paid higher of ARC or PLC, whichever is higher. Beginning for next year, you'd have to re-enroll and choose which program you want to be in. And in crop insurance, coverage levels increased dramatically. Beginning, farmers qualify for additional premium support over a longer extended period. Supplemental coverage options increased. We increased funding for MAP and FMD, which are those two marketing programs that are important to wheat exports. A lot of important things that were in that reconciliation bill. It checks off most of the dots on what was desired in the Farm Bill.
Right. So like those discussions of when and where a Farm Bill was going to happen over the last 18 months was a lot of discussion that our ag groups were having. And when we got to the point where this reconciliation bill was going to be moving forward, and being able to have ag have an emphasis in that, a lot of that attention turned towards these issues, and being able to see these priorities that we were wanting to see come out of a farm bill be included in this bill. Yes, you're exactly right, because what we needed to do is have that safety net put in place with where we're at right now with the ag economy, and then being able to get those other wins. We were further away from getting a farm bill done and getting them in place for agriculture. It was a very good thing. And now we'll begin the discussions about what a smaller version of a farm bill will look like. But definitely feels better, and I know our national organizations feel good about what came out of this bill, Aaron.
Yeah, a few more details in the Senate appropriations markup. That was for the FY26 agriculture spending bill. There is, in that Senate version anyhow, $1.5 billion for Food for Peace, $240 million for McGovern-Dole. It also requires a report from USDA on transferring Food for Peace from USDA to USAID to USDA, I think was important. Increases by $1 million the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative, which is also very important to the public wheat breeding programs here in the United States. And as I mentioned, that Small Grains Genomic Initiative, which is important to fund the Wheat Genetics Resource Center through K-State, which is housed here at the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center. So a lot of work to be done, but a lot of good accomplished.
Just to add on to what you said about the different provisions that we saw, the Food for Peace, it was good to see. It's probably not quite at the level that we had hoped, but being included in there is a positive and allows us to have those discussions, especially if Food for Peace does stay within the State Department. Those funds that might be a little bit less than what we had originally hoped or what had been in the past for Food for Peace, having those discussions with those folks in the State Department on implementing that program, making sure that U.S. grown commodities remain a major component of that, and not what we've seen over the last decade where that's been deteriorated and those funds being less U.S. grown commodities and more cash, or in some instances actually buying Turkish flour or wheat from one of our competitors for those programs, and how that taxpayer then, when they do that, actually ends up working against where those tax dollars were generated. So being able to work with those folks who are going to implement those programs, I think is going to be really, really important for us. I know from a state level, being able to have our FSA office be ready and to implement these programs for our producers, from every indication that we're getting from leadership over there, that they are ready to hit the ground running and get this implemented for producers, along with that emergency assistance that has recently been passed. So those are all encouraging things at a time that our ag economy, with the lower commodity prices that we're dealing with right now, will be a good thing.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit of a plug here. We've got a podcast episode with David Shem, the state director for the Kansas Farm Service Agency, be released here in the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. We're recording this episode on Saturday, July 12th. Harvest is, really hopefully wrapping up in the state of Kansas, although it rained again last night in western Kansas and eastern Colorado. The rains have followed the harvest this year because they were just getting rolling in eastern Colorado, and now it's starting to rain there. So what are you hearing? What's the situation? We know they knocked the total harvest number down a little bit last week.
Yeah, so on as of Friday, that's when the July crop production report came out, and I do think it was a lower number for Kansas from where that initial number was, and so from 353 million bushel production down to 335 million bushel production, which, as you and I both talked about, it seems consistent with the reports that we've been getting about the variability, and that late infestation of wheat streak mosaic did have an impact not only on yield but test weight. And so I think that number by USDA takes into account those reports of the high variability that we've seen as harvest progressed from the southern border up to the northern border in northwest Kansas, and seeing that range in yields from whether it was 20 or 30 bushel yields at challenged areas to areas that were able to benefit from that good filling period and moisture that we heard yields of 70 or 80 bushels. The quality is also seeing some variability. I think because of the lower test weights and the rains that we had in that I-35 corridor, this may be a year where, as a state, we may be challenged to reach that 60 pounds per bushel for test weight as a state average, just because of some of the lower test weights that came in the later part of harvest, but higher test weights in the western part of the state, or the wheat that got harvested before the rains. It will be interesting to see what the overall state average will be in the proteins, because of the yields being a little bit better than what we've had the last couple of years in those drought years, where we've had 13 and 12% average the last couple of years. It seems like that protein average for the state's going to be around that 11.7, 11.8 range, if I had to guess it where we're at right now, Aaron. But I do think that it was a learning year for all of us, right? With the wheat streak mosaic virus, that late infestation, and I know you're in a lot of discussions with K-State. I know a lot of our farmers will be thinking about that as they're managing their fields, getting ready for planting this fall, and their variety selection.
We'll have another podcast released, I think, on around July 22nd, where I visited with those experts at K-State to talk about what happened with the disease situation this year. And it is a timely topic. Farmers are just trying to wrap up their harvest and exhausted, and some of them are frustrated. And I hate to come back and keep saying this, but it's essential that we get the volunteer wheat under control. There's going to be volunteer wheat because of the rainfall we've had and the seed that was scattered out in the field through some of the storm damage and the chattering. And keeping that volunteer wheat dead at this time of year really starves the wheat curl mite, which is the vector of those disease packages. So just keep following us on social media and K-State. K-State just released through their agronomy department wheat-free dates. So they've actually defined windows across the state of Kansas prior to planting where we need to have that volunteer wheat dead to starve those curl mites so they don't move into the new wheat crop and infect the new wheat crop. So be sharing that publication. I think it's going to be very useful for farmers. That's just one of the steps that we can take to mitigate this problem heading into next year's crop. Justin, I mean, it's a little bit early to start thinking about this. What implications do you think all this has for planted acres this fall?
Well, I think it will have some implications. I think moisture situation will have implications as well, if depending on how our moisture profile looks 60 days from now. That always does impact wheat that might go behind soybeans or rotations out in western Kansas. But for the most part, our farmers are so diversified in Kansas and their cropping rotations that a lot of that cropping rotation is pretty set, and they don't like to get it too far out of whack by making in-season type decisions. I do think that due to cropping rotations, because of maybe some modifications that they might make, we may see a little bit lower acres this fall, especially with where price is at. So if I had to guess it right now, I would say wheat acres might be a little bit lower going into this fall. Through those harvest reports, though, heard multiple people talk about how, especially in some areas where they haven't been able to have straw residue the last couple of years, how excited they were to get that straw residue from this year's crop, to get that back into their cropping rotation, and what that means to ground cover, catching moisture, preserving moisture, and what that means to their cropping rotations. And so I know that you've done a lot of work in Romolo and communicating, the value beyond the grain initiative. So I think that if I had to guess it right now, wheat acres might be a little bit lower this fall, but we'll see what conditions are.
Beyond the value of the grain is that messaging we're talking about, is the value beyond the price that farmers receive, when they sell the wheat, and that straw, as you mentioned, is worth a lot of money. Cropping system, crops following in that rotation, yielding more because of that straw, and that straw staying around for several years in that field has a big impact, and we'll be having more information coming out about that. Well, let's turn a little bit to some international markets. There was some news this year just recently coming out of Indonesia.
I think it was a pretty exciting announcement that we were able to see, and I know U.S. Wheat Associates, Vice President Joe Sowers in that region covers those markets, has been working really closely with the Flour Milling Association and buyers in Indonesia. And of course, Dalton Henry, Vice President Trade Policy with U.S. Wheat Associates, has been involved in those discussions, and being able to have that announcement where they're making a commitment of buying for this year, I think it was 800,000 tons. And then for the 3 or 4 years, is going to be 1 million ton purchases from the United States. And and seeing those type of discussions and announcements, it's what we need to see, but it's exciting to see, especially with everything that's going on with total trade talks and tariff talks, and to see something like this comes out that will work in. It's not directly involving USTR or the administration or government officials, but the industry professionals that are signing an agreement like this that then will play into those other discussions. Indonesia is obviously a very large wheat market for the products that they make. Hard red winter wheat will be a major fit for that, and so announcements like that are exciting to see, and knowing that there are discussions going on right now with South Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Those are all major wheat markets as well, and so we're hopeful that those outcomes are going to have some not only positive overall trade benefits, but will have a impact on wheat. And where we're at right now in global competitiveness, one of the challenges we're having with price right now is because global wheat prices are pretty low. And so there's a recent article that just came out talking about Black Sea wheat and Russian wheat production, and how Russia wheat exports had one of their lowest months in quite a few years. The month of July, there was one of their deputy ag ministers had made a comment about how they're going to try to have an initiative to try to help promotion of wheat exports. To me, you can read that article of, yes, their farmers are probably hesitant to sell wheat at these low prices, and it becomes somewhat of a short squeeze on exporters that have sold wheat and needing to get wheat to meet those contracts or deliver those contracts. As we've talked before about how Russia is the largest wheat exporter in the world, and to me, that article really emphasized things that we've talked about how there's been such a national and strategic intent by Russia to be dominant in the energy and food sector for exports, and to have them at those high-level officials that are recognizing and watching their wheat exports and what that means to them strategically, and trying to curb low exports. To me, it should be a wake-up call to our ag industry that, we need a national interest and intent, not only to make sure that we're meeting and growing our domestic demand, having that it can't just be that domestic demand, that we have to have some type of national strategic intent to make sure that we are competitive in a free marketplace and being able to get our products out in fair trade and get trade barriers down, but then also making sure that we're doing the things we need to do on production, adoption of technologies, but then have the right infrastructure and incentives for our grain companies to handle and export and compete in this global marketplace. And I'll probably use that article in a different way in trying to communicate that importance of trying to have a national wheat strategy and breadbasket diplomacy from the United States so we can be a global player in competing in this space.
I know you've had that vision for a national strategic, wheat plan. And how does something like that come about in when you think about that? Who would the players be?
Well, I think it certainly starts with our leadership in D.C., and we've got good people in place. And with the announcement this last week with National Farm Security Action Plan, it tells you that whether it's Secretary Rollins or Senator Marshall or other leaders in D.C. are seeing this importance of agriculture and production agriculture in the United States, because all of that does feed into, if you're talking about the security of U.S. food system, production agriculture, it's not just, it's all of those things. It is making sure that we're protecting intellectual property. We're doing, have America First ideas on our domestic market and creating demand and the right policies in place to support our production agriculture, but not sacrificing on those export markets because how important they are. And so I think where the discussion is right now around that gives me hope that we can build on that and include discussions about the importance of humanitarian assistance and food aid and what that means, not only by creating a portion of demand or movement from our bushels, but being able to deliver those bushels to areas around the world that has instability that's been created by not just weather conditions like drought, but actually war or civil unrest, and trying to get food into those places to try to help stabilize those areas. But then also that building of goodwill and showing the world that the United States can be, through soft diplomacy and soft power like humanitarian assistance, can help those regions and help those people in those areas. And I think that when you talk about security, national security, global security, that all kind of fits together. And if we can have deeper discussions about where wheat fits into that and what we need to do from a policy standpoint about having a national wheat security plan, I think all of that comes into place. The production efficiency, our transportation, our infrastructure, and then our emphasis on being able to get into those markets and have a presence around the world to commercial markets, but then also emerging markets, that our product and us being able to provide a free market option are all things that would be taken into account in a discussion like that, Arron.
Well, I hope that vision comes to place. I know you're a champion for that, and hopefully you can find some other people to be co-champions on that. Let's test the limits of the podcast here. Bring it back to the domestic marketplace. Joe Rogan last week called bread poison. First of all, I'd like to invite Joe Rogan to be a guest on the podcast. Just put that out there.
Yeah, it'd be a good get.
It'd be a good get. So he was referencing another influencer, a food influencer on TikTok or something, that had supposed accurate information that said that the usual messaging out there that bread has been modified, gluten has been modified, and bread was just not healthy. And how do we combat something like that? We, as an industry, it's certainly not helpful to have that out there.
Well, we need to be able to respond in a meaningful way when those type of discussions from very significant big audience individuals are going to make comments like that or take on these type of issues. We need to be able to collectively respond from a producer, the milling industry, dietitians, nutritionists, our baking companies in a meaningful way to provide the right information to make sure that people understand that as a healthy component of diet, that the benefits that fortified flour with folic acid and vitamins and fiber and all of those things that play into a healthy diet, and why it's not wrong for me to enjoy a bacon sandwich every now and then. And so, but that's a challenge we have in the wheat industry, and being able to come together and try to put out the right information and make sure that large, big voices like a Joe Rogan, can hear the other side of the story. That it's not, it's social media is definitely changing how people receive information, the mediums that they receive information through podcasts and TikTok or whatever it might be. We've got to make sure that from a wheat industry and from perspective, we're positioned in a way that whether it's Wheat Foods Council, Grains Food Foundation, that it's not just a message from farmers who comments like that directly hurt farmers, right? If you're going to talk about lessening the demand by that type of information or those kind of comments, that everybody across the value chain needs to be able to provide in a meaningful way the accurate information, to have that as part of that discussion and being able to respond to those comments so that the average consumer or average listener to media can get both sides of the story and make their own decision.
Yeah, I think that's great input. I recently had a conversation with an author who was a food historian, and we had a discussion looking back 20,000 years on the history of wheat and bread as a food and what it means for civilization. And wheat has always been a processed food. It has to be processed. You can eat the whole kernel, sure, but what makes wheat great is processing. So it all comes down to that processed versus ultra processed foods. Sometimes those things can get a little blurry, but I agree with you. Having the right experts on hand, and there fortunately was some good response to what Joe Rogan said on his show, but we certainly need more of a unified effort to respond to those kind of things.
Yeah, just to talk about, I went to school to process wheat into flour, right? Kansas State University Milling Science degree, where by definition, you take a wheat kernel, you drop it through roller mills. The roller mills scrape the bran from the outside so that you get access just to the endosperm white flour on the inside. Then you sift that out, and by definition, that becomes at risk of being considered a processed food. And so making sure that type of information, accurate information, is out there and part of these discussions that are going on, it's becoming certainly an elevated topic with our decision makers, and making sure that consumers getting the right information is what we really need to focus on for the products that our farmers are producing.
Always important to remind everybody, 1 out of every 5 calories consumed by human beings every day on the planet come from wheat. And we need to...
I know, it's getting close to lunchtime too here.
That's right. So pizza's on the menu.
Okay.
Justin, thanks.
It's good to be with you, Arron. And again, nice job with your podcast, and keep up the great work.
If you have a follow-up question for us, please email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. And you can always access previous episodes at wheatsonyourmind.com or wherever you find your podcasts. Please subscribe, and thanks for listening.